The wind screamed like a banshee down the bony branches of the ancient banyan trees, their roots grasping up the crumbling stone walls of the abandoned fort. It was a wind that bore secrets, the whispers of ancient horrors on the windless air. Abbas shivered, pulling his tattered shawl tighter. He'd heard the tales, the cold legends of the fort, told in hushed whispers by the villagers. They said it was cursed, haunted by the ghosts of those who died a horrific death within its walls. He'd dismissed them as old wives' tales, the superstitions of simple people. Until tonight, he looked back at Bakhtiar, his childhood friend, who was playing with the dancing lantern. Its weak light cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to twist with a life of their own. "Are you sure about this, Abbas?" Bakhtiar's voice was barely above a whisper, tinged with a fear that was the same as Abbas's own. "We could go. No one would ever know we were here." Abbas wavered. They were treasure hunters, driven by rumor of a hidden treasure of jewels within the ruins of the fort. Desperation had brought them here, a hunger to escape the poverty that gnawed at their lives. "We've come too far," he said, his voice sounding braver than he felt. "Think of the riches that could be ours." They walked on, their footsteps echoing ominously through the thick silence. The fort rose before them, a black shape against the dark sky. The heavy wooden gates, rotten and splintered, hung loose on their hinges. As they passed through, a gust of wind slammed the gates shut behind them with a deafening crash, plunging them into darkness almost as black as the night outside. "Did you see that?" Bakhtiar breathed, his eyes wide with fear. "The gates, they closed by themselves." Abbas tried to speak calmly, but his heart was racing in his chest. "It was just the wind," he said, though he knew in his heart that it was a lie. The wind had died moments before. They walked deeper into the fort, the light of the lantern casting decaying buildings and overgrown courtyards in a pale glow. The air was heavy with the smell of mildew and rot, a smell that clung to the back of their throats. As they walked into what looked like a grand hall, a cold blast swept through, sending their lantern out. They were plunged into darkness absolute. Panic burst into Abbas's breast. He stumbled for his flint and steel, his hands shaking uncontrollably. Just as he was able to create a spark, a whisper slid through the darkness, close enough it seemed to touch his ear. "Leave." The voice was harsh, guttural, full of an unendurable sorrow. Abbas was frozen, every muscle in his body tense. He was not alone. They were not alone. He finally succeeded in reigniting the lantern, his eyes sweeping the hall. Bakhtiar was frozen, his face white in the dancing light. "Did you hear that?" he breathed, his voice trembling. Abbas nodded, unable to speak. The whisper had been so clear, so real. "We have to get out of here," Bakhtiar begged. "Now." But as they turned to make a dash for it, the stone slab came crashing down in the doorway, blocking their escape. They were trapped, and the whispers were growing louder. The stone slab crashed down with such force that the whole hall seemed to shudder. Debris and dust poured down from the collapsing ceiling, filling the air with a choking cloud. Abbas coughed, his eyes streaming. Trapped. The word repeated itself in his head, a cold knot of fear twisting in his belly. "What was that?" Bakhtiar screamed, his voice on the edge of hysteria. He pulled at the stone slab, his nails scratching uselessly over the cold, hard surface. "We have to get out!" Abbas fought to keep his head, but the fear was a crushing weight. He searched the slab, trying to find a weak point. It was huge, easily several tons in weight. "It's no use," he said, his voice on the edge of despair. "We can't move it." Bakhtiar slid down the wall, sobbing helplessly. "We're going to die here," he moaned. "We're going to die in this accursed place." Abbas sat down beside him, a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We're not going to die," he said, trying to sound reassuring. "We'll find another way out." He stood up, his eyes searching the hall. The lantern light flickered across the room, showing intricate carvings and faded tapestries. He saw a narrow passageway hidden behind a tapestry. "Look," he said, pointing at the passageway. "Perhaps that leads somewhere." Bakhtiar sprang to his feet, hope in his eyes. "Let's go." They pushed the tapestry aside, and Abbas held up the lantern to light a dark, narrow passageway. The air in the passageway was cold and damp, and there was the hint of rot. The corridor dipped downwards, and they descended into the depths of the fort. As they moved, the whispers grew to a crescendo, swirling around them like a malevolent cloud. They seemed to come from the walls themselves, seeping into their brains, filling them with a rising sense of dread. "Get out." The whispers spat. "This is not your place." Abbas attempted to block them out, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. But the whispers would not be silenced, eating away at his mind. He could feel Bakhtiar shaking beside him, his fear overwhelming. The corridor gave way to a small room. In the center of the room was a stone altar, smeared with what seemed to be dried blood. Abbas felt a shiver run along his spine. This was not right. Something ancient and evil clung to this place. Suddenly, the flame of the lantern flickered and died, plunging them once more into darkness. A blood-curdling scream shook the room, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. "Bakhtiar!" Abbas roared, stumbling through the darkness. "Bakhtiar, where are you?" Silence. There was only the sound of the whispers, now louder than ever, swirling around him in a maelstrom of tortured voices. "He is ours now!" They spat. "You are next!" Panic gripped Abbas. "Bakhtiar!" he shouted again, his voice cracking with terror. He struck his flint and steel with wild urgency, hoping for a spark of light to cut through the suffocating blackness. At last, a small flame sprang to life, and he hastened to light the lantern. The sight that greeted his eyes chilled his blood. Bakhtiar was stretched out on the floor, his eyes wide and his face rigid, staring blankly at the ceiling. His chest was stained with a dark crimson pool. Over him stood a shadowy figure, its form indistinct in the dancing light, but its presence unmistakably evil. Abbas recoiled, his breath trapped in his throat. The figure raised a hand, and a wave of icy cold washed over him. His heart seemed to be shrinking, his limbs heavy. He attempted to scream, but no sound issued from his lips. The figure moved closer, its shadowy form solidifying. A gaunt face with hollow eyes, burning with an unholy fire. It was an apparition, a monster of nightmare, its very presence exuding pure evil. "You have trespassed," the figure croaked, its voice a cold mockery of the whispers. "You have sought what is not yours. Now you will pay the price." Abbas dropped to his knees, paralyzed with fear. He shut his eyes, preparing for the inevitable. But then, a thought flashed through his mind, a desperate cry for deliverance. "I don't want the treasure," he shouted, his voice shaking. "I just want to go away. I swear I'll never come back." The figure hesitated, its burning gaze fixed on him. "You swear?" it hissed. "I swear," Abbas stated, his voice urgent with conviction. "I swear on my life." The figure did not respond for a long time, as if considering his words. Then slowly, it started to disappear, its shadowy form dissolving into the darkness. "Very well," the voice breathed, its power fading with each passing second. "You may go, but remember this. Greed always comes at a cost." The figure disappeared completely, leaving Abbas alone in the room with the body of his friend. He crawled over to Bakhtiar's side, tears streaming down his face as he wept. He had come looking for riches, but all he had found was death and despair. He spent what felt like an eternity crying for his friend, the weight of his guilt bearing down on him. Eventually, he was able to stand. He had to get out of this accursed place, to do justice to Bakhtiar's memory by living a life free of ambition and greed. He turned and ran from the room, stumbling through the dark corridor, guided by the faintest glimmer of moonlight filtering through a crack in the wall. He did not stop running until he stumbled out of the fort, gasping for air beneath the cold light of the moon. He did not look back. Abbas stumbled through the night, his body aching, his mind tormented by the vision of Bakhtiar's dead eyes. He walked for hours, driven by a primal need to get away from the accursed fort and the horrors within. As the sun rose, he saw a faint glimmer of light in the distance. A village. Hope flared in him, a fragile ember in the darkness of his despair. He entered the village, his legs heavy with fatigue. It was a small, barren village, crouched in the shadow of the mountains. The houses were of mud and straw, their roofs sagging with age. The villagers, their faces etched with hardship, watched him uneasily as he drew near. He approached a hunched old woman sitting beside the well, drawing water. "Please," he croaked, "could you tell me where I am?" The woman looked at him, her eyes filled with a queer mix of pity and fear. "You are in Kotli," she said, her voice little more than a whisper. "A place best forgotten." "I need assistance," Abbas begged. I was ambushed at the fort. My friend is dead." The woman's eyes widened with horror. "The fort?" she gasped. "You went to the fort? You must be mad." She nodded to a man sitting nearby, his face etched and lined. "Faizan," she said. "This man claims he was at the fort." Faizan approached Abbas cautiously, his eyes studying. "What happened there?" he asked, his voice serious. Abbas hesitated, unsure what to tell him. "We were searching for treasure," he admitted, his voice little more than a whisper. "But something ambushed us. My friend is dead." Faizan's face darkened. "The fort is cursed," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Many have gone there seeking its treasure, but none have ever returned. You are lucky to be alive." He took Abbas to a small hut on the edge of the village. "You can stay here tonight," he said, "but you must be gone in the morning. We don't want any trouble brought to our village." Abbas accepted the offer gladly, falling onto a straw mat in the hut corner. He was too tired to complain, too heartbroken to worry about their mistrust. He slept fitfully, tormented by visions of the Shadow Man and Bakhtiar's cold gaze. He was awakened by Faizan looming over him, his face grim. "You must depart now," he said, "before it is too late." Abbas nodded, recognizing the somberness in his voice. He thanked Faizan for his benevolence and stepped outside into the village. As he made his way through Kotli's winding alleys, he noticed the villagers regarding him with a mixture of hostility and fear. He felt their anger, their wish for him to leave, to take the curse with him. As he made his way to the edges of the village, he heard a soft whisper on the breeze. "You cannot escape." He spun around, his heart racing in his chest, but there was no one in sight, only the wind whipping through the parched grass and the unfriendly eyes of the villagers. He pushed on, anxious to be away from Kotli, but he couldn't help feeling that he was being observed, that the curse of the fort had followed him to this damned village and would haunt him wherever he traveled. As Abbas left Kotli behind him, he couldn't help but sense that eyes were upon him. The whispers followed him, soft and insidious, creeping into his mind, consuming his sanity. He walked for days, crossing dry plains and treacherous mountain paths, seeking a refuge but finding despair. He finally ended up in a larger town, hoping to lose himself in the anonymity of the crowd. But the whispers kept coming, growing louder, more insistent. He was losing his mind. He was going mad. One evening, While he sat alone in a crowded tea house, a veiled woman sat beside him. She had dark, piercing eyes. "You are being followed," she said to him, her voice low, insistent. "The shadows are closing in." Abbas sat frozen, his eyes staring at her. "Who are you?" he asked. "How do you know?" "My name is Abida," she said. "I see things that other people don't see. I know about the fort, about your friend, about the curse that hounds you." Abbas felt a cold tingle run down his spine. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice shaking. "The creature you saw in the fort," Abida said. "It is a djinn, a powerful spirit bound to that fort. It feeds on greed and despair. It won't stop until it has consumed your soul." "What can I do?" Abbas pleaded. "How can I get rid of it?" Abida hesitated. "There is a way," she said, "but it is perilous. You need to find Noor-Bano, a wise woman who lives in the mountains. She is the only one who can help you." "Where is she?" Abbas asked. "She lives in a remote village deep in the Himalayas," Abida answered. "The journey is long and dangerous, but if you are to survive, you must find her." She put a small, intricately carved amulet in his hand. "Take this," she said. "It will offer you some protection from the djinn, but be warned, it's no promise. The djinn is powerful, and its reach is long." Abbas took the amulet, his hands trembling. "Thank you," he said, his voice full of thanks. "I don't know how to repay you." Abida smiled sadly. "Just live," she said, "and don't forget, the shadows are always watching." She turned and dissolved into the crowd, leaving Abbas alone once more. He gripped the amulet tightly in his hand, his heart a mixture of hope and fear. He knew that the journey to find Noor-Bano would be fraught with danger, but he had no choice. His life hung in the balance. He departed that very night, bound for the towering Himalayan mountains, searching for a glimmer of hope against the stifling darkness. The journey to the Himalayas was long and brutal. Abbas traveled treacherous mountain roads, battling snowstorms and biting gusts of wind. The landscape was cold and barren, reflecting the despair that gripped his very soul. The whispers continued to plague him, growing louder, more menacing by the day. He clutched Abida's amulet, finding a small measure of comfort in its presence, but he knew that it was not enough. The djinn was cruel, its presence a constant shadow in the corner of his mind. He encountered other travelers on the journey, pilgrims and traders who were also subjected to the harsh conditions. But he maintained his distance, fearing to draw attention to the clutches of the djinn. He rationed his meager rations, pushing his own limits of tolerance. One evening, sleeping in a secluded cave, he was awoken by a chill presence. The air grew cold, and the whispers became louder, swirling about him like a maelstrom of despondency. He glimpsed a dark shape moving in the shadows, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly flame. The djinn had discovered him. He clutched the amulet in his fist, repeating old prayers learned in childhood. The figure faltered, stepping back a little from the force of the amulet, but it did not depart. "You cannot hide from me." The djinn snarled, its voice a cold whisper in the cave. "Your soul is mine." It launched itself at him, its shadowy claws outstretched. Abbas shut his eyes, bracing himself for the worst. But then he heard a voice, a powerful, commanding voice, cutting through the darkness. "Begone, foul creature," the voice boomed. "This place is protected." Abbas opened his eyes to behold an old woman standing before him, her face illuminated by a soft, ethereal glow. She wielded a staff in her hand, its tip aglow with a warm golden light. The djinn recoiled, hissing with fury, before disappearing into the shadows. The woman turned to Abbas, her eyes full of compassion. "You are safe now," she said. "I am Ilea, a guardian of these mountains. I have been waiting for you." She led him deeper into the cave, where a small fire was lit. "Abida sent you, I suppose?" she asked, Abbas nodded, still trembling with fear. "She said I should seek out Noor-Bano," he said. "She said that she was the only one who could help me." Ayliya smiled. "Noor-Bano is my sister," she said. "She resides in a secret village not far from here. I will bring you to her tomorrow." Abbas felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had finally found someone who could help him, someone who could help him escape the constant onslaught of the Djinn. He spent the rest of the night in the cave, under Ayliya's guard, and found a small measure of peace he had not known since arriving at the cursed fort. The next morning, Ayliya led Abbas along a twisting path through the mountains to a secret village deep in a silent valley. The village was an oasis of peace, its people living in harmony with nature. He could feel a tangible sense of peace and tranquility, a stark contrast to the darkness and despair that had haunted him for so long. Ayliya led him to a small cottage in the center of the village. "This is Noor-Bano's home," she said. "Prepare yourself, for the ritual will be demanding." Noor-Bano was an old woman with a peaceful face and piercing eyes that seemed to pierce to his very soul. She greeted him warmly with a warm smile, her presence radiating wisdom and compassion. "Welcome, Abbas," she said, her voice warm but firm. "I have been waiting for you. I know of the horrors you have endured, the curse that clings to you." She led him to the cottage, where herbs, crystals, and ancient artifacts crowded the cluttered space. "The Djinn has a strong hold on you," she said. "But do not despair. We can break its power, cleanse your soul." She set up a ritual, a complex series of chants, prayers, and symbolic movements. She had him stand in the center of a circle of salt, surrounded by burning incense and fluttering candles. The air was thick with exotic scent and ancient incantations. As the ritual went on, Abbas felt a strange energy flow through his body. He sensed the presence of the Djinn, lurking just out of sight, resisting the cleansing power of the ritual. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, trying to shatter his focus. Noor-Bano's voice grew stronger, her chants more intense, pushing back the darkness. She summoned the forces of light, calling out the names of ancient spirits and gods. The amulet Abidah had given him glowed with warmth, its power added to by the ritual. Finally, with a resounding crescendo, Noor-Bano released a flood of energy, a wave of pure light that enveloped Abbas, sending the shadows fleeing and silencing the whispers. He felt a deep sense of release, a lightness he had not known in years. The ritual was finished. Noor-Bano smiled, her eyes filled with satisfaction. "You are free, Abbas," she said. "The Djinn has been banished. The curse has been broken." Abbas collapsed to the ground, tears streaming down his face. He was finally free. He had vanquished his demons and emerged triumphant. He thanked Noor-Bano and Ayliya for their help, their guidance, their unwavering support. He left the village an altered man, his heart full of hope and thanks. He went back to his village, committed to leading a truthful and compassionate life, keeping Bakhtiar's memory alive by helping others to liberate themselves from the clutches of greed and hopelessness. He never lost sight of the horrors he had witnessed in the accursed fort, but he no longer dreaded them. He had learned that in the bleakest of times, there is always hope, always the chance for redemption. Thank you for watching Haunting Whispers. If you liked this story, please like this. Let me know what you thought in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more horror and suspense stories. What other stories would you like to see?